Good evening, welcome everyone. I am very happy to introduce you to Ian's webinar on human factors. My name is Paula Chiesa. I am an anesthetist from Buenos Aires, Argentina, and I am happy to be moderating this webinar together with Professor Robert Greif from the University of Bern and Ana Isabel Pereira from Portugal. Also, I am proud to introduce today's speakers, which are Dr. Alexander Fuchs. Hello, Alexander, from the University of Bern in Switzerland. Also, Dr. Andy Higgs, who is a consultant anesthetist and also specialist in critical care from Warrington, UK. And who's also the former treasurer of the Difficult Airway Society. And last but not least is Dr. Cristina Diaz-Navarro, who is a consultant anesthetist in Cardiff, and also the Associate Dean for Simulation in Healthcare and Improvement Ways, and an Associate Professor from the School of Medicine in the University of Barcelona. Well, now to you, Tino.
Okay, only because there's a first question in the Q&A. This is an English-speaking webinar. There's no translation simultaneously. My job now is to tell you the importance of this webinar, why we are doing this. In airway management, we have a lot of devices, strategies to improve patient care, and we're doing a lot. Over the last years, more and more importance is given to what we call human factors, and this is maybe a strategy where we really can still improve airway management, and therefore we thought from the society's point of view, let's have a look what we can do in this area of briefing, so the stuff before, using checklists, cognitive aids in anesthesia, in the operating room and at the ICU. And when we then have done the case, what's going on afterwards? So what's about the debriefing in the OR or at the ICU? So what we call clinical debriefing. And therefore we invited people to present their experienced insights into these 3 points. And this 3 speaker will cover this. And yeah, that's overall the big picture why we are doing this. And with this, Paula will give you some words how the webinar works.
Yes, I'd just like to say that for this webinar, we like to interview the experts. And for that, we also need the audience. We would like you to write down in the Q&A box all the questions that may come across your mind. We will then forward them or we'll read them to the experts, so that we can all participate in the interview. So shall we move forward to the first poll? Miguel, please. Do you use an anesthesia-related checklist before starting every case? I am asking the audience to answer yes or no, please.
Mm-hmm.
Great, it's almost a shared answer. So half the audience is already using, approximately half the audience is already using checklist, and the other half is not. let us see if we bring forward the change. Anna, would you like to introduce Alexander to speak about checklists?
Yes, so now we have Alex, and he will be addressing the pre-induction checklist they use in INSEL Hospital and the experience they have these last 5 years of its application. So Alex, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, good evening. I just start to share my screen and now you can see my slides, I guess. So good evening to everyone. I want to talk the next minutes about a pre-induction checklist and give a 5-year analysis of our experience here in Bern in Switzerland. I have no conflicts of interests to declare, and I would like to start with a background and relevance. So 10 years ago, I think all of you are aware of this publication. It's one of the publications you need to know if you're doing airway management or research in airway management. It's the NAP4, the National Audit Project 4, which was held in 2011. And it was a huge study in the UK and revealed some major complications of airway management. What they have done is an observational study. They recorded over 1 year all airway managements and their complications. And interestingly, they found that poor planning or a missing airway plan or failure to plan for failure were some of the main reasons which led to problems. And this was in 10% of the cases. So in 10% of airway management cases, we had some complications. This was quite a big number, and that led to the development of or the implementation of human factors in several difficult airway management guidelines. So, and
this was 10 years ago, right, Alex? So what's out today?
Yeah, you're right. Exactly. Now it's all good. We should think. But yes, so sorry, that was one too much. So this is a recent published article in 2021, and it's about intubate. It's an Intube study. It's about intubation of critical ill patients. And interestingly, it revealed that 45% had at least of the patients who were intubated had at least one major adverse peri-intubation event, with over 42% on cardiovascular instability, and 9% or over 9% had a severe hypoxemia, and even 3% suffered from a cardiac arrest. So even today, this is a big thing, and I think we can improve with improving human factors. So what we've done in Bern, what we've done in Bern was an observational study. And this observational study took place in 2015. So the Departmental Airway Research Group did a before and after study on airway management related events. And we found out that we can improve with some little changes in our daily practice. And one of this was the development of an airway checklist. And this checklist was then introduced in our digital anesthesia information system in May 2016. So,
and how does your checklist exactly look like?
Yeah, so here we go. Our pre-anesthesia induction checklist has 4 themes. So we have the equipment theme, the patient theme, the communication, and the feasibility. And what you see here is a picture of an often checked pre-induction checklist. So all boxes are already marked. So this is all digital, and if you open the pre-anesthesia induction checklist, all of the boxes are red. And then you discuss every point within the team. We are doing this while we are pre-oxygenating the patient. So we have 2 to 3 minutes for pre-oxygenation, and this is a perfect moment to do this check. So we look over, do we have an anesthesia machine which is checked in the morning? Do we have a leakage test which was good? Is the APL valve open? Do we have a CO2 monitoring? Do we read a capnography? And this is really important. We really check if the mask is sealed and if the patient, while he's breathing, has a CO2, and we detect a CO2. Do we have the suction device activated? Do we have all of our airway material? So it's not only the tube, it's all the video laryngoscope, maybe the stillet, maybe we need another laryngoscope as a backup solution, maybe we need a supraglottic airway device. And we check also if the intravenous line is working. Then we go further to the patient. Is the position of the patient good, or do we need something like a ramping, or for small children, maybe a sniffing position? And we just check if the face mask seal is really tight during pre-oxygenation. And as we are in Bern, we are doing a lot of stuff in apneic oxygenation, or with high flow or low flow apneic oxygenation. We consider always to administer additional nasal high flow or low flow oxygen. And then we come to, I think, one of the most important topics in this list is about communication. So we talk about allocation of roles and distribution of tasks within the teams. We make clear that the one who's doing the airway, the one who's looking after the cardiovascular stability, giving vasopressors, giving the medication. What is our plan A? Do we just intubate, or do we have an SGA? And what are we doing if we fail to intubate? So we are just going down a little bit a list, and we're discussing all these points. And while discussing all these points, we just make our plans. So finally, we also talk about what happens after airway management. How do we proceed? Do we have volatile agents, or do we proceed with a total intravenous anesthesia? And the monitoring, do we need another arterial line or central venous line, or what else? So we discuss all this before we start the case, that we have all the things together we need for the case. And at least we discuss the feasibility. And this is a little bit a door opener for speak up. So are there questions open? Is something not clear? Do we have we done the WHO checklist and all that thing? Finally, if everything is fine, we just give the everything okay, and we have a timestamp on this checklist.
Okay, and having this said, why should we use a pre-induction checklist?
Yeah, that's a good point. So there are some really good studies about the World Health Organization checklist. There are some studies about pre-induction checklist, but the evidence, yes, it's hard to find. Some say yes, it's good. Some say we don't have an evidence that we change outcomes. But I think the pre-induction checklist provides the structure for a short airway briefing, and briefing can stimulate better communication. It opens, as I said, for speak up. It opens that everyone can place his thoughts or doubts about the procedure. And as we know, miscommunication can lead to patients' harm. So being prepared for a crisis might reduce cognitive overload while being in the crisis. And I love that book, Thinking Fast and Slow. It tells us really much about how bad we are in decision-making when we don't have time for decision-making. So
was it easy to implement in your department this pre-induction checklist, or did you find it was somehow hard or found some barriers at all?
Yeah, that's a good point. So at first, technical, it was quite easy. We just implemented in the digital information system. So technical, there were no problems. But we had some colleagues who were very skeptical about that. And they told us, oof, you want to introduce this, you want to do this before in front of a patient. Are you sure? This could be very, yeah, this could be a discomfort for the patient. This could be very unsettling. So what Sabina Becker, she's one of our colleagues from the Airway group in Bern, what she has done was observational study. And this is really interesting because patients, so we just asked the patient, and we performed the pre-induction checklist in front of the patient while he was awake. He had no premedication. And we asked him later on, how was your feeling? Did you feel discomfortable or something? And they told us, no, that was great. We value the potential safety benefit. Keep on going, keep on doing that. So this was really funny, and we could implement the pre-induction checklist without these doubts. So now I'm coming to one of the key points in my speak. I think a checklist is useless if it's not used. This is a really nice quote we have from an article, What Went Right, Lessons from the Intensivist, from the crew of US Airway flight 1549. That was the plane which landed on the Hudson River with Captain Sullivan. Maybe you know the story behind that. And we wanted just to analyze, what about the adherence to the checklist? Because if you ask your colleague, everyone is using the checklist. That is clear, everyone in every case. And we were like, is it really like that? We doubt it. So what we have done is we analyzed from directly after implementation from June 2016 to July 2021. And what you see in the black color is the adherence probability. So for all teams together. So the adherence was at the beginning around about 42%, and it improved to 56%. And we were wondering, is it for all teams the same, or do we have like different data for different teams? So we did a sub-analysis for all the different anesthesia teams we have in the hospital. And this is really interesting. We have some, or mostly, of the teams which are acting really good, which have a good adherence probability. Those are visceral thorax, those are orthopedics, neurosurgery, ear, nose, throat. And we have some which are slightly in the middle. So maybe 40 to 45%, which is the non-operating room anesthesia. It's a red line you see, or the E8 emergency anesthesia. It's a blue line you see. It's about 40%. And we have some teams which are very, very low. So we have cardiovascular anesthesia, which is around 18%. And we have the pediatrics, which are under 5%. So what I think, what needs further investigation or further improvement is to discover or to research, to do some research. Why is it the probability so bad for some teams? And why is the probability so bad of adherence for the emergency airway management? Because it's really, really interesting. The higher the urgency, the lower the compliance. So we thought a little bit about it, and we think that some point could be that teams are under time pressure. And another point would be, especially for the pediatrics, you can't do an airway checklist in front of a child, because if the child is in your anesthesia room, you have to take care on the child. But we are not sure. It's just a thought. So also the checklist has some limitations. The checklist is not the holy grail for airway management. So it is still allowed to use your brain, and it's strongly recommended to use your brain. And it cannot replace training, skills, or expertise. So here are my key points. The introduction of a pre-induction checklist is feasible. The compliance and the adherence can improve over time. What we are doing in Bern, we regularly enforce with simulation training. We regularly do simulation training every 6 months to 12 months, and there every team member is enforced to use the pre-induction checklist. And what is important, audits can monitor adherence to find weaknesses, as we found in our checklist. And we have to keep on doing research why they are so bad.
Alex, thanks for your presentation. There's a question. Where are the checklists? Is it part of the patient's documentation, or are they in the operating room, emergency room, etc. in the theater?
So in our department, we have an electronic anesthesia information system. So everything we are doing, we are not writing anything on the paper, we just do all on the computer. And this checklist is implemented there in the computer system. But it's not, you can start the procedure without doing the checklist. It's not like you have to do it and then you can start the procedure. So we have somehow linked it in the interface.
So it's part of the patient's documents?
Yes, exactly.
Mm-hmm. And then I have another doubt. There was a publication in 2020 in JAMA in which Turner doubted the usefulness of checklists. I mean, it was questions whether it brought an interesting outcome or not. What do you think about it?
Yes, it's a really nice publication. So I was, what should I say? So what the authors did, they looked at the first, at the primary outcome, and primary outcome was defined as death. So it's quite a tough outcome you have for airway management. And I'm not sure if all the studies included have the appropriate power to have a death case in their airway management. Another point is what they have done. They then another secondary endpoint was hypoxemia. And hypoxemia, interestingly, was, with the use of the pre-induction checklist, not so often. So somehow they showed, oh, we have less hypoxemia events with the use of pre-induction checklist. And another secondary outpoint was the first pass success. Well, that's quite a good outpoint for an airway study, but if you use a pre-induction checklist, I doubt that there will be changes in the first pass success of intubation. So I think it's not a good outcome to monitor quality of a pre-induction checklist.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for your presentation. Now we will carry on with Andy and Paula about cognitive aids for airway management. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Higgs, would you like to start telling us about your use of cognitive aids?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. I assume you can hear me now. Thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Thanks, Alex. I'm going to echo some of the points that Tino made, some of the points that Alex made, and make some of my own. Essentially, I think that what I'm going to tell you is about why, how, and who should use cognitive aids in airway management generally, particularly in ICU. So there we go, my slides move. So as Tino said already, it's obvious that human factors is probably the most important aspect of improving outcomes. of airway management. We have all the devices we're probably going to get for a generation, okay? We have to perhaps learn how to use them, but we have all the devices that we have that we have already. The way to impact airway disasters is to concentrate on human factors. NAP4 has already been mentioned. Well, after NAP4, a group of psychologists and clinicians looked at those cases again and found that human factors were present significantly in every single one. So we know what we want to do when we manage airways. But basically, when all goes wrong, things go to pot, we stop thinking, and the situation will run away from us. So cognitive aids are a way of unloading your working memory, your executive function, such that you don't have to recall as much, and you can devote what brain power you have to executive decision making. All right. Things, the most obvious, the most commonly used probably worldwide now is the Vortex. That's on the right, we have the co-pilot, which is often used in the UK by airway assistants in the UK. As Alex has already mentioned, a checklist is a very good cognitive aid, and I'll be going through how I use that as well. Just having a bedhead sign telling you what airway problems have been encountered in the past in ICU patients is a useful cognitive aid. So really, anyone can manage easy airways. A lot of patients can be intubated by a monkey with a proverbial spoon, all right? What we're talking about is difficult airway management, and when apparently simple airway management runs away from us, when the manure gets airborne. Why do we use cognitive aids? Well, because we're human. Humans have very little cognitive processing power. You can see here from my slide that long-term memory is obviously different from the executive power, the short-term working memory of the central executive, which is what you rely on in airway emergencies. But even the long-term memory only has a capacity of about 1 gigabyte over 70-year lifespan. And we can only hold between 4 and 7 points in our mind at any one time. That means, and that gets worse as we get stressed. Everyone's heard that you shouldn't do, human factors gurus are always saying that you shouldn't do anything if you're tired, hungry, angry, or late. Well, essentially that means I should never get out of bed in the morning. But there's a lot in that, all right? As airway crises evolve, the demands to act grow and the demands to think grow. But we then move from the green area where we're in control and we can guide events into the red area where we lose control. We are not in charge and we need some help. And cognitive aids really are about helping us when we need a little bit of support. There's a great cognitive scientist called Michael Tomasello, who has worked out that human beings our cognitive systems are collaborative. We were never meant to act alone, particularly in crises, okay? Now, the structure of the medical profession is that doctors are at the top of the tree, we're at the top of the hierarchy, and we're expected to do it, or we expect ourselves to do everything. And that simply is not consistent with the way we have evolved. That is not consistent with the way our brains work. Human beings are not great repositories of facts. And it turns out that collaboration in decision-making in the very rapidly and in the long term probably as well. But that is the secret. The collaboration is the secret of success. And cognitive aids, you can use cognitive aids with your team. Cognitive aids turn the me of airway management into the we. It's a way of involving your team and getting them to help you in a crisis. All right. Experience will only get you so far. Experience will reduce stress to a certain extent. It will improve your pattern recognition and will functionally, it doesn't actually improve your working memory, but it improves your functional working memory. But still, that the effect of experience is limited. Even very, very experienced airway operators, expert airway operators, lose control of a situation when faced with an airway crisis. You've all seen this kind of diagram in presentations before, where as people get more stressed, their ability to perform cognitive, their cognitive reaction time increases, their complex motor skills deteriorate. Everyone's familiar with this. And there is an optimal level of stress. You've all seen that before. But the way to use what cognitive aids are is a way of unloading your short-term working memory, right? So that you don't need to rely on factual recall. You can get other people to do that. You can have those facts in front of you, or more ideally, your members of your team prompting you with facts and suggestions during an airway crisis, so that you can devote your executive function, your working memory, to making decisions, all right? And you're not overloading yourself. I think of it really as, we've all got, during our training, we all had a mentor. We all had a mentor who we thought, in this situation, what would Dr. X do? Well, this is what Dr. X used to do when you were faced with crises, when you're training, was they wouldn't tell you necessarily what to do. They would make suggestions. Would you like to try this? Do you think now is the time for X? Now is the time for Y? Shall we stop? Whatever. It's the power of nudge. And that's what cognitive aids can be used for. So cognitive aids do impose structure, as Alex talked about in terms of the checklist. And when you talk through a checklist, and I'll come on to that in a second, it imposes structure such that your team can recognize when things are running away, when you're losing control, when the situation is going away from everyone, and they can prompt you to remind you, they can point out that things in the first place aren't going well and what you might do about it. It's about sharing the mental model. This is the checklist that, sorry, Paul.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for explaining so clearly what cognitive aids are and why they should be used. But could I just ask you which ones you use?
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Paul. This is obviously the checklist that we use in my ICU. We've changed it slightly for COVID. And in fact, the laminated versions of this disappeared during COVID, but this is the basic airway checklist. And I'll come on to how we use that in a second. What we have done in our Warrington Airway Management course is actually train our non-airway specialists, our ICU nurses, our airway assistants, A&E nurses, to help us in our airway management. You'll see that this checklist helps to prepare the patient, prepare the equipment, prepare the team, and prepare for difficulty. Now, what we do is try to get the other members of the team to prepare the patient, to prepare the kit, and that empowers them, all right? And they become automatically part of the team. They're not just helping the airway operator, they are part of the airway team, all right? And as we move to the right hand of the checklist before we start, I actually talk through what I'm going to do. I verbalize to my team. I use this as a cognitive aid to go through, and this is what my plan A is. This is what I'm going to do. This is the kit I'm going to use. This is how I'm going to do it. This is what I'm going to do if it doesn't work. I'm going to go to I'm going to go from a low pro size 3 glide scope. I'm going to bag mask during it. I want you to keep an eye on time. I want you to keep an eye on the monitors. I want you to give the drugs. And if that doesn't work, I'm going to go to a size 4 supraglottic airway device. This one, the laryngeal mask, I'm going to tell them specifically. And then I'm going to a scalpel bougie tube, front of neck airway. All right. And then I invite people to ask questions. So this is empowering my team to help me when it all goes wrong. And in fact, the non-technical skills people, the psychologists, will tell you that if you go through all of these points in a pre-induction checklist, you cover most of the human factors, right? This is too short a presentation to go through all of the human factors aspects which are covered during a good checklist, but it is most of them. And when we were designing this checklist for ITU, this is the ICU group that produced the DAS Airway guideline for the critically ill. And you'll see on the left there is Tim Cook. And Tim Cook, no less a person than Tim Cook, says that he never, ever attempts intubation of a patient without using a checklist and cognitive aid. And if it's good enough for Tim Cook, it's good enough for me, and I suggest it's good enough for most people. So speaking, that empowers the team to speak up. When I run into problems, I want them to start throwing ideas out at me, right? I invite comments. In the 2015 guidelines for airway management from DAS, we had the stop and think box. If we got to a point where we could maintain oxygenation, what we could do is then stop, think, and consider our options. But you'll see that in the ICU guideline, which followed 2 or 3 years later, we changed to stop, think, communicate. And that's prompted by the cognitive aid, which is there when we induce anesthesia in the ICU. This obviously is the Vortex, the most commonly used cognitive aid around the world. And I can just about remember tubes, face masks, and supraglottic airway devices. But what I really use it for is the prompts on the side. I want my airway assistants, the rest of my team, if I'm running into difficulty, just to prompt me, right? As an actor who freezes under the stress on stage, I want them to prompt me and say, have you thought about manipulations? Have you thought about adjuncts? Have you thought about paralyzing the patient? And all that is a way of cognitively unloading my central executive functions. You might want to ask your audience, are they familiar with best effort? Because what that cognitive aid does is allow you a best effort. What it does, it tell you what a best effort is. A best effort is a tube, face mask, or supraglottic airway device. And if you've actually attempted a best effort and failed, it's time to just bin off that approach and move to something else because you can't improve it. So you might, I don't know whether or not the audience wants to do that or consider it, and we'll discuss that in questions later. You will have noticed during airway crises, even the most intelligent of your colleagues forget the most simple things. They're becoming cognitively overloaded. The first thing they forget to do is they forget the first thing they learned at school, how to count to 3, right? We say that airway management, you get 3 attempts. Maybe an expert can have a 4th, but you've got 3 attempts. But how many times have you seen airway crises where someone's intubating attempts 5 and 6 times or more? They can't tell the time. They lose complete track of time. So what we built into our cognitive aid, the algorithm there, is someone is nominated to record the time, because most airway incidents, most airway disasters don't happen within about 30 seconds of induction. They actually take quite a while after the patient goes off to sleep before you reach a can't intubate, can't oxygenate scenario. And that's because they're spending a great deal of time putting everything but the kitchen sink down into someone's airway, and they are traumatizing the airway. They're traumatizing the tissues. So it's about the importance of fellowship. The best cognitive aid you've got is the one used by someone who is standing at your right or your left side, who can watch you, who can see the mistakes you're making, it's got a bird's eye view of the situation. They're not as stressed as you, and they can comment on what you're doing and prompt you. They can just nudge you and say, doctor, do you want this? You said you were going to use this if this didn't work. Do you want to use it now? When you've lost yourself in the moment. One thing I think is important is that if part of your team suggests something, never ever dismiss them, because even though you have no intention of doing that, it's a good idea that the next time they may come up with something good. But if you slap them down first time, you get slapped puppy syndrome, and they're not going to come up, they're not going to verbalize anything in the future. This is a case I was involved with in the UK about 4 years ago, unrecognized esophageal intubation, and actually the possibility was raised by a surgical registrar, but he didn't have, he wasn't confident enough to mention it out loud so the operator could consider it. Specific points then, just to close, cognitive aids can't be complicated. Keep them simple, all right? You're using them under stressful situations. They have to be very simple. You have to have practiced with them beforehand. Look at all these people in the room managing an airway problem. They all have to be familiar with them. They all have to have trained with them, and then you can optimize how they actually work. They have to be accessible. What we've done with Sam Goodhand, the registrar in the UK, is actually turn the checklist into a credit card, which goes on the bleep, the airway bleep in the ICU. So it's always there. It never gets, you can spill coffee on this, you can put it through the washing machine, it stays intact and it's there. And what DAS has done is circulate this to every ICU in the UK. And so they all have 4 copies of this to go on the airway bleep. So it's always there. Language is important. We all talk about phoner or e-phoner, but if you're a non-English speaker, and if you're a non-English speaker who is the non-airway operator, like an ICU nurse in Africa, phoner doesn't mean anything. It's an acronym of the English language. So what we're trying to do with the Puma project, which I'm alluding to there on the right-hand side, is we've converted phoner to neck rescue. And that translates into any language in the world, okay? But phoner doesn't. It has to be universally applicable across disciplines, across countries, and also the cognitive aids have to be useful for intubation, as they all are aimed at, but also for the most common form of anesthesia, that is the supraglottic airway anesthetic. So if the intended airway is a supraglottic airway, we have to have a cognitive aid which helps us with that, and face mask as well. And we're working on that with Nick Crimes and the Puma group. Alex did actually touch on a resistance of certain people to use checklists and cognitive aids. And that's certainly true of seniors, but there's good evidence from Lowe et al. in 2016 showed that junior doctors don't feel threatened by the use of checklists in the same way that perhaps seniors find their professional integrity threatened. And so there is hope yet, but it calls for a bit of humility in the use of them. I always have to mention video laryngoscopes. They're the best, well, they're one of the best cognitive aids, actually. If your assistant can see what you can see, they can they don't need to be asked about optimizing burp or cricoid pressure or whatever. That's a cognitive aid. They can see it in front of them, okay? And the best cognitive aids you've got are your colleagues using prompts like the Vortex, like an algorithm, one of the DAS algorithms or one of the other many algorithms around the world, because they can see what you don't see, they hear what you don't hear, and they can think for you when you're struggling. So in the future, well, in the Puma group are actually working on a real-time app, and it will enable you to plan your airway management such that you can plug in the problems, plug in what you're going to do to a patient. And if that doesn't work out, you can plot a course of in a strategy of airway plans to adopt if the first one doesn't work or the second one doesn't work. So that's in progress at the moment. So thank you very much, Paula.
Thanks to you, Andy. Thanks for all these very clear explanations. There's one question from the audience. How do you provide feedback to your team regarding the use of checklists and cognitive aids?
Well, in terms of feedback, that usually comes with it's usually in the coffee room afterwards, actually, and that's the best way of doing it. It's informally, but it's making a point of doing it. I make a point whenever we've had a problem, I always make a point of going to people afterwards and saying, "What do you think? How do you think I performed? How do you think the team performed? And what could we do to improve it?" And actually, you learn more about airway management being just chatting to people after a problem or a potential problem. Near misses are much more common. But even after near misses, you learn a great deal about how you perform under stress and how you can improve simply by getting just by asking people who know a bit about airway management what happened and what they thought about it. It's very informal.
Yeah.
Andy,
and it stresses the importance.
And
Sorry, Tino, go
there's
ahead.
a short question because you mentioned Puma several times in the Q&A. Sultan asked, when do we expect the next part? And who would be the best person to answer this than you?
Yeah, well, as I think I'm probably the current rate limiting step with Puma. I hope Nick isn't watching this. I think that we'll get something published, the next 2 articles just before Christmas, around there, in anesthesia.
Okay. Because time is running, and Paula brought this in. How can you give best feedback? This is really the transition to the next part, to our next speaker, Christina, because she will start to present the part afterwards. So how can we do this feedback debriefing in the clinical environment? And with this, nothing else to say. Christina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was thinking exactly the same. I was thinking this feedback in the coffee room is what we call clinical debriefing. And I agree, it's the best way to learn. So I will share now my presentation with you. Can you all see it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I'm going to be talking to you about TOC, which is a very easy way of doing clinical debriefing. I have to declare that I am very close personally to the TOC project. Firstly, because I am the international coordinator of a grant that we received from the European Union, and also because I do chair the Board of Trustees of the TOC Foundation. And what I would like to highlight in this very short presentation is what debriefing does in education, how that can be translated to clinical debriefing, and how the TOC framework can help us debrief in clinical environments easily.
So, Christina, let's get started. How would you define debriefing in education? Because this is the first point.
Absolutely. Debriefing in education. It's really difficult to define it by looking at the literature, and there are so many different definitions. So what I've summarized here is how I debrief in education. And I think that the beauty of debriefing in the simulation environment after an exercise, or even educating in clinical environments, when you have an expert debriefer, we facilitate learning and reflection, we achieve the session's learning objectives, we address performance gaps, and what we do with this is we uncover what is behind our behaviors, the emotions and pressures that have affected us, the differences between the knowledge we've got and how we have applied that knowledge, what our working mental frames are. All of these issues that Andy was mentioning, perhaps we should be talking about after each airway emergency. Also, debriefing helps us in education to develop non-technical skills and to identify positive behaviors that are taken for granted and new strategies that can help us improve our own performance and our team's performance. And this closing of performance gap is what leads debriefing in educational environments. And there are so many ways to do this. There are lots of different approaches, lots of different structures. It can be facilitator guided, it can be self-guided. I don't want to emphasize this too much because these are techniques that are used by experts in educational environments, and they take a long time to train. They're very, very helpful, and they're very helpful if they are around as well in clinical environments. If you've got individuals who are able to provide this degree of expert facilitation in clinical environments, it's invaluable, but it is not always there. And typically, when we debriefing education, we follow structures. Cognitive aids are useful in all fields, not just in airway management. So there are lots of structures, and one of the most classical one is DAA, description, analysis, and application. It's a very, very simple structure, but it very much tells you how to organize the discussion around debriefing.
So I have now a rough idea of what's debriefing in education, and as you have it here, so what is the difference to the clinical environment? Yeah, and that's exactly what we were asking ourselves. The background of my group is in simulation education, and we are expert debriefers, and we train expert debriefers. But we thought, why are we not doing this in clinical environments? And if
if we debrief in clinical environments, who should be leading the debriefing? Who should be taking part in it? What would be the purpose of that debriefing? And how do we carry it out? Particularly, how do we make it safe? So that's a tricky question. So clinical debriefing has got a very clear place within structured team communication. We've talked about team briefing in the beginning of the theatre sessions and in the beginning of the case. Then we carry out an activity, and then we can have a conversation at the end of the activity to review the events, to reflect, to learn, and to apply any learning or any solutions. And that revision is the debriefing. So the World Health Organization defined clinical debriefing a long time ago in 2009 as an individual or a team formally reflecting on their performance after a particular task, shift, or event. So this is quite different from what we're saying in education. In education, we're looking at mental models, we're looking at performance gaps. What the World Health Organization tells us is that what we want is people that work together, thinking together, sharing their perspectives, and to do that regularly. So we go from one extreme to the other, from too much guidance to not very much guidance at all. But the thing is, clinical debriefing is recommended by a large amount of organizations around the world. And there is plenty of evidence that debriefing is a good thing because it improves our performance, it improves patient outcome, and also it helps our own staff to feel better, to be more resilient.
So the next question would be for me, how can I apply this now in my clinical practice? Or how can I do this specifically after an airway management experience case?
Yeah. So you've got two ways, either with an expert facilitator, if you've got one, and that is fantastic if you do have access to people like that, or you can teach teams to debrief themselves. And these two ways have got advantages and disadvantages. So if you've got expert facilitators, they will have the expertise to deal with really difficult situations, with conflict, with emotional stress, and with trauma. And they will probably help us think in a way that we might not have come up with ourselves. But of course, it's difficult to have these people available for every clinical situation. And also there is the possibility of being hierarchical. The thing is, when I perform as an educator, I think that I am a co-learner. And I say that to myself, but there is no doubt that I know what I'm teaching, I know what I want people to learn, and somehow I am in charge. So if you bring that to the clinical environment, it does bring a level of hierarchy, which might or might not be beneficial. Now, if you teach teams to debrief themselves, they can do that anywhere and at any time. We cannot forget that clinical teams are extremely familiar with their everyday work, and they know what things are good and they know how failure looks like. So they know exactly how they are doing and if things are as good as usual or they could be improved. Also, if we encourage teams to debrief themselves, that means that we are encouraging reflective practice, and that's a way of growing for all of us. And then we're sharing that reflective practice democratically. And then if we find any possible solutions, we can even engage with applying those solutions and engage with improvement. And that is a big, big positive. So that is why team self-debriefing is the avenue that we are following. It does not mean that expert facilitators do not have a place. That's not at all what I'm saying. Expert facilitators are brilliant, and have them if you can. But whether you have them or not, team self-debriefing can go a long, long way in improving your practice. So what we did then is we developed TALK in a way that it would be very easy to use, very widely applicable, not specific to a specialty, and that would help the team to come up with practical outcomes, and that could be used after any learning situation. So that is everyday things that we can learn from that are not particularly negative. And I want to emphasize this. We don't need to only debrief when things go wrong. We can debrief when things go well, and we can learn a lot from that. And the aim of this is to promote reflective practice, patient safety, and a supportive culture of dialogue. So we applied for a European Union grant, which we were very, very happy to receive in 2016. This was a Marie Curie grant, and this has allowed us to continue developing materials, continue researching how to make this possible. And the institutions involved in this grant are from Barcelona, Cardiff, and also from Stavanger in Norway. So we came up with the concept of talk in 2014. We presented internationally, and then we started to collaborate through this grant. But it soon became apparent that the project was getting a lot greater than the grant, and we were having lots of collaborators. So we initiated the Talk Foundation in 2018 in order to ensure that the non-for-profit spirit of this initiative continues to be so. So currently we've got collaborators in 18 countries. And to support the spread of the word, we have recently published the concept in Trends in Anesthesia and Critical Care. It's open access, and by all means, have a look at it if you're interested in the subject. I can see that your hand is up.
Yeah, so what does now talk mean? I guess it's an acronym. What does it mean?
Yeah. So the talk framework, talk stands for an acronym that will be explained to you in a second. But what we want to do and to promote is firstly to highlight that in clinical environments we can learn every day, and that clinical debriefing can be just a team conversation after something that we can learn from about any aspect of patient care where everybody's perspective matters, and that allows us to identify ways to learn and improve. So we know that as clinicians, all of us work together because we want the best for patients. And the fact is that we are able to behave professionally in really difficult situations that we have day in, day out. And we are familiar with our working environments, and we're familiar with the structured conversations. We use SPA, we use the ABCDE approach to talk about our critically ill patients. And if we do this together, and we have these discussions together, different professional backgrounds will allow us to have different perspectives and different knowledge. So keeping that in mind, we should really be able to debrief anytime, anywhere, safely, with or without facilitators, in a constructive way, in a non-judgmental way, and prioritizing patient safety above all else. So this is the acronym. T for target, A for analysis, L for learning points, and K for key actions. But I've got a little video for you that will explain you this a little bit better perhaps than I can do it over one slide. And please let me know if the sound doesn't sound.
In clinical environments, learning opportunities arise every day. Talk is a structure that guides a learning conversation between team members following a case or clinical session. This dialogue is called clinical debriefing. It should be a short, focused discussion lasting no more than 10 minutes. It could take place immediately after a case, at the end of a clinical session, or later at a suitable time. Having a talk conversation may be useful following good outcomes after difficult cases, when team members are exposed to new clinical experiences, after near misses or serious untoward events, or in other situations. Talk gives a structure to the discussion so that it is carried out constructively and focused on a common goal. Any team member familiar with the structure may lead the conversation. Clinical debriefing should ideally take place in quiet and private areas, and intended in a blame-free manner. The conversation should focus on learning and improving patient safety, respectfully, avoiding negative comments and identifying positive actions and behaviours, valuing everybody's input, identifying small objectives and following up outcomes step by step. We use talk to find practical solutions for improvement. These small changes impact positively on both teams and the organisation.
So, what we do is, as teams, we ourselves find solutions and take responsibility for applying those solutions to those little problems that annoy us daily. And that matters, that empowers people, and that allows us to make a change. The follow-up to this action happens as per local culture. So we don't force people to follow up in a certain way, but we do encourage follow-up. And what we do really is we do a little bit of aggregation of marginal gains. We get a little bit better every time, and we encourage continuous improvement. Tell me, Tina.
You were talking quite a lot about safety. How can you do this in a safe way, not hurting other team members? What's the proposal from Talk for this?
You know, this is such a good question. And what we were so worried when we started this project in 2014, we thought people are going to abuse the system and have a go at each other when they're having a debriefing. So firstly, I have to say that we've not heard of one single case of an untoward debriefing since we started this project. And secondly, we felt it was very, very important, firstly, to have organizational support. So all of our tools have got the stamp of the organization where they are being used. But also, we felt it was really important to be explicit on what values are behind this project. So the values that we encourage are really the ones that our previous presenters have been talking about. They've been talking about professional communication, about valuing everybody's input. We add on to that to be positive and identify positive strategies and behaviors when we are discussing how we have performed and how we have done what we have done. To avoid negative comments and choose neutral expressions instead. And this is something that requires training. It makes a big difference between saying, you have done this and you shouldn't, or saying, this happened. What could we do next time to avoid it? The emphasis is so different if we choose to be neutral in the way that we address these issues when something is to be addressed. But it is not less important than actually emphasizing when something has been particularly helpful, because individuals that have been particularly helpful might not even notice it. So to encourage this reinforcement of positive behaviors matters an awful lot. And also, let's make changes step by step. We're not trying to change the world in one go. We're just trying to make little changes that add up. So that is what the acronym does. But I want to explain to you the steps a little bit better, and I will do that with another very short video.
Starting to talk. Talk is a clinical debriefing framework which follows 4 steps. Target. The first step is choosing the focus of the discussion, being as specific as possible.
So, what should we discuss to improve patient care?
Team members share their perspective and agree on what is important to discuss.
That sounds good. Let's talk about that.
Analysis. Team members review the agreed target, in particular, how to repeat successful outcomes or identify areas for improvement.
This went very well. How can we do this again? This was challenging for us. How can we do things better next time?
As part of this step, team members propose improvement actions. Learning points are shared by the team members.
So what can the team learn from this experience?
Key actions. Team members agree on solutions and take responsibility to carry them out and follow them up.
What are we going to do? Who is going to do it? How will we all know that it's been done?
Talk enables teams to make small changes that matter. Small changes can make a big difference.
So I think this is really a good program and a good plan, but does it really change something? So can you really make our clinical environment safer?
Well, the thing is, we can. The answer is very, very simple that way. And I can tell you that it can in 2 different ways. Firstly, because we have been researching this for the last 3-4 years. And the results coming forward are very much proving this. We're looking at publishing before the end of the year. So hold on to that. But also, I think stories matter an awful lot. And I want to bring you 2 little stories. One of them was when we published our website, we allowed individuals to tell us their stories of use of talk. And one of the first things that came to us was from a non-UK country. It was anonymous, so I cannot tell you what country it was, but from the language, I can deduce that it was not in the UK. And what they told me was that they had a difficult situation managing an airway in the emergency department. And they did the talk debriefing, and they decided that they have to have an intubation trolley and drugs ready for intubation every day in the department, which is very interesting because we already knew that, isn't it? I mean, there has been ample publication and ample guidance from all societies that we should have our emergency intubation kit available and as ready as possible. And yet it takes having the conversation to make it happen. So we have had examples of this in many occasions. It doesn't mean that what people come up with is particularly innovative or super clever. They're just simple things that can be done, that could have been done before, but somehow the conversations have not taken place. And having a simple structure like this allows individuals to have these conversations and empowers them to implement these solutions that we know about. Another case that impacted me greatly was a case that comes from Norway, in which I gave a short webinar in Norway. Actually, not a webinar because it was a seminar those days. It was in person, and one of the nurses, a neonatology nurse, took the tool back to her working environment, and I thought this is never going to work. One person trained in this tool going to a whole department, how is that ever going to make a difference? But I came across her later on, about 6 months later, and I asked her, have you used TOC? And she says, yes, we don't use it all the time, but when we use it, people are very happy. And I said, and why is this? She says, well, they hear good things. And I'm like, well, that's brilliant. But have you made any changes? Oh, yes. And she told me about this neonate who was having a lumbar puncture unsuccessfully, and the registrar tried to get this sample and couldn't, and the baby cried, and everybody got quite stressed. And then instead of going to have a coffee and moan about the registrar who hadn't had much luck with his lumbar puncture, they all stayed together after the case and had a talk conversation. And they decided that in fact, if the registrar had used local anesthetic, it would have made life easier for everybody, for the baby, for the registrar, and for the rest of the team. So they decided to change the protocol. So in that unit, all neonatal lumbar punctures are now done with local anesthetic. And I thought, wow, if one person can make such a difference, imagine all of us doing a little tiny bit. Anyway. Sorry, Tino, if you're talking to me, you're muted. Tino, you were muted.
I like the stories, but I was telling you only we are running out of time. We should round this up.
That's okay, because I'm nearly finished. All I wanted to say is that, to my surprise, the TOC tool has been adopted organically and people have asked to use it. And that wasn't my experience before. Typically, you have to push to get things changing and to get things moving forward. Just to say that we are a charity. We provide lots of free materials. In fact, they are all on the website and they have been translated to 8 languages. You've got all sorts of guides and videos. And again, as a charity, we do provide courses and educational events, and we try to do that aiming for inclusivity, accessibility, and quality assurance. If you want any more information, you can look at our website or you can write me an email. And I just want to thank you for inviting me to this webinar.
Thanks a lot. Really great presentation. May I jump directly into some questions and also invite all the speakers to come back? I would like to ask a question to all of you. There are quite a lot of comments in the chat. Why is it so hard to implement this stuff? It sounds all very clever, checklist, cognitive aids, talk. Why is it so complicated to implement this? Andy, short comment.
I think it's structural. I think that for the last 500 years, we have turned medicine into very much a hierarchy. And in airway management, the hierarchy has traditionally begun and ended with the operator. such that no one else really feels that involved. And cognitive aids and debriefing, well, if there's only one important person in the room, why would you debrief? You just have a conversation with yourself. But now we've progressed. We've learned that actually we're social animals. We work together, and we do actually get better results when we work as a team. And now we have to overcome 500 years of cultural tradition and actually start talking to each other.
Alex, from your point of view, short answer.
Yeah, this is really one of the best questions, because if we know the answer, we could change this whole system right today. Well, I think it needs some change of attitudes. That is also what Andy mentioned, the senior attitudes, the egos. I think we need to work on this topic.
Christina, implementation, you have some experience. What is your comment, your suggestion for all the people out there to do it?
I think we've had a better experience than we expected. We thought it was going to be really, really hard to implement, but it seems to be taken up from the bottom up really easily, and people like it and find it useful. So I do get requests for debriefing regularly, which, you know, it didn't happen before we started doing this. So I think, firstly, we can through our example change the world a little bit at a time. I think that when we do good things, it has ripples, and I think that role modeling is so important. And I'm sure that anybody who works with Andy or with Alex are learning from their very knowledgeable attitude towards human factors, and that replicates itself. So I think that it is just slow, and it looks like it doesn't happen, but it does happen, and it does happen in front of our eyes. We just have to have a bit of a longer perspective and keep insisting.
Paula, microphone on.
I suppose we shall send the second poll question. Miguel, please, since we were talking about change, and now it's about time to ask our audience if you are willing to push for the change. Will you introduce a checklist in your workplace environment? I will just remind you that about half of the audience was not using a checklist yet. Could you please answer yes or no? Well, great. It seems 96% is willing to move forward to change and introduce checklists. Since we are close to the webinar's end, Tino, if you agree, I would like to summarize. So the things we'd like you to remember from today, at least, are the principal points about checklists, cognitive aids, and the clinical debriefing tool talk. Checklists, as Dr. Fuchs explained, are feasible to implement and start working with. Their compliance will improve over time. It is, however, necessary to work on them regularly. Simulation can provide enforcement for that. It is, however, necessary to provide audits that will monitor adherence and identify the things to improve. Then, as regard cognitive aids, as Dr. Higgs so clearly explained, they allow us to download the right file when crisis arrives. We have, with cognitive aids, the right working memory in our minds and also in our team. They give the chance, the rest of the team, to prompt us with help. And finally, the talk initiative is a clinical debriefing tool that is very easy to implement. It can be carried out after everyday situations. This means when everything happens, regardless the outcome is good, bad, or something to improve. It can be carried out in after everyday situations. It provides the frame for conversations that lead to practical outcomes. The goals of talk are to increase patient safety and to promote a supportive culture of dialogue. Tina, would you like to add anything else?
No, I think you summarized all the stuff. The last thing is, what's next?
First of all, I would like to thank you for joining us. Thanks for the experts. Alexander, thanks for joining us. So Andy and Christina for sharing your time and expertise with us, and also for your engagement in preparing for the webinar. Thank you also Anna and Tino, and thanks to the audience for joining us and bringing forward all their questions. We hope that this webinar has provided you with tools that would help in your clinical practice. I would also like to thank the technical team, Mariluz and Miguel. And my last word is I would like to invite you to our following webinars, our next webinars. They will be held in October the 27th. We are proud to host Dr. Mary Mushambi and Dr. Eric Uten to talk about airway management in obstetric anesthesia. And later on in November, there will be a webinar on COVID-19, 2 years with coronavirus. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have a good evening. Cheers. See you next time.
Yes, thank you. And remember, if you want your certificates, please send an email to our secretary asking for them about this brilliant session. Take good care and stay safe.